Right, hello. My name's Jerome and I work at NCC Group. I used to work with some of these losers. I'm a pen tester and this is a presentation on hash length extension attacks, which I will describe in glorious and perhaps nauseating detail. So this is the case where you might see some user input, you might see some data that comes back to the user in the form of, this is like sort of web app context. So you're busy surfing away on some kind of site and it wants to send you some data for whatever reason, but it wants that data to come back, but it wants to make sure that there's no tampering involved. So what you might see is an integrity check applied to it, where it takes a hash of a secret, which is a server-side secret, and the message which it's sending down to you. And let's say here that we're just doing a simple concatenation. So where we see a plus, we're just doing concatenation. So it might send you some super secret data down. It wants to make sure that you don't tamper with it. So it also accompanies that with a hash. And the way it generates that hash is to take that super secret data, prefix it with some secret that only the server knows, and sends the hash along with it. And therefore, if you tamper with it, when it goes back up, it will recalculate the hash based on what it sees and will know if something's gone awry because it won't match the hash that's gone with it. Make sense? Yeah? So that's basically the context of this. So as I said, whenever the message is potentially subject to interference, the hash is sent alongside and that kind of helps to protect it. Any message tampering will be detected. But this is actually potentially vulnerable to what is called a hash length extension attack. So some characteristics of this are that the secret is a prefix. The attacker knows the message and the hash, which is quite typical in these scenarios because that's why you're doing it. You know, you've got the message coming in full view of the user and it's accompanied by a hash. So that particular restriction isn't normally a problem. And you need to be using a vulnerable algorithm, and there are plenty of them. There's a couple of exceptions like SHA-384, but you know some of the common ones, SHA-1, MD5, SHA-256 you might see in this context are vulnerable. So a little nod here to Sarush, who you might know at that Twitter handle, who's at NCC, who was talking to me about this because he saw it in a test. And then wrote a little CTF based upon it, and he was describing it to me, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. It would be nice to sort of explain that in a nice, lengthy and perhaps tedious presentation. So here we go. So how are we able to exploit this? So what makes the hash vulnerable? So the hash algorithm is chewing on the input, and at the end, the internal state of the algorithm is the hash. So you know, MD5 is chewing on the message that you're sending into it, it's digesting it, and then the internal state of the hash algorithm at the time that it runs out of input is the hash. So the point here is that we can set the internal state of the hash algorithm to start from the hash that we've seen. So if you have a hash given to you, you can set MD5 to start at that hash point, like set its internal state, and then carry on and like feed it some more. So now you have a hash for a longer message that starts with the original input that you started with. And it doesn't matter if that input began with a secret because you don't need to know that. If you imagine that, you know, MD5 is chewing on some data that's like this big, and you know it's taking, and we'll see later, it takes it a block at a time, so it's chewing some data, going along. This is your secret here, so it's producing. Then you get a hash at the end of it. Well, if you start your MD5 algorithm at this point and then feed it some more data, it'll just carry on from that point. And it doesn't matter that you don't know what the data is over there, because it's, this is the vulnerability. It's relying on that. So exploitation, well, that sounds quite easy to do, but it's not always that simple. So let's imagine this example. So we are transferring, you know, some money, and we've got an account from, an account to, and some values and whatever. And there's a hash that accompanies with it. And the hash is the MD5 of these bits of data concatenated together, prefixed by the super secret password of secret. So that hash, which is clearly not a real hash, but you know, just for convenience, is the MD5 of secret with that value that value, all concatenated together. So from what I've described, that sounds like quite an easy attack. All I need to do is set the MD5 state to be that, which we know, feed in a 0, and we now get a new hash. So that sounds like we're now transferring £1,000, and because we're able to recalculate the hash, it will look at that and go, oh yeah, you did mean that, and we've managed to transfer more money, or whatever the context is. So from what I've described, that looks like that should work, because I've said, you take your algorithm, you put it in an initial state. It doesn't matter what has happened beforehand. We just put in an extra bit of data, here is 0, and we should generate a hash that corresponds to this input. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. So why doesn't that sort of work? Well, MD5 is a block-based algorithm, and as you might know from encryption schemes and the like, that block-based algorithms need some kind of padding. So padding is used to prepare the input before it's digested to make it into a nice even number of blocks. So different algorithms use different schemes. Let's look at MD5. So if you take a message M, the input that MD5 actually works on is your message with some padding and then the length of the message. And different hashing algorithms will use different schemes. They'll use different bytes for the padding. They'll use a different way of specifying the length of the message. That could be the amount of bytes they use, whether you're talking about little endian, big endian. There's all sorts of variations there. But this will do for us. And this makes the actual input to MD5 some whole number of blocks in length, because we're padding it out. So what does that mean for the attack that we just looked at? Well, let's go back to what we were looking at. So we've got this is the URI. So you've got an account from, an account to, the amount, and the hash. Now we added an extra 0 there, hoping that we might be able to transfer some more money. And this is our revised hash. So this is what we'd actually like to hash. But when we run our hash length extension attack, the input to the hash is not exactly that. Because what we've just said is that when MD5 takes a message, it adds some padding, it adds a length, and then it hashes it. So we've actually got some padding and length in there that we've got to take account of, because that original hash, which was AA, BB, whatever it was that concatenated with 100 with some padding and some length. So that means that when we sort of wind our attack on, we've got to incorporate that padding and length into it, because that is the input that gave that particular hash. So what it says, when we run our hash length extension attack, the input to the hash is really that plus padding plus length plus 0, and then because we're feeding that into MD5, some further padding and some further length. So it's actually a lot more sort of complicated. So the app is checking this particular hash. So we've got $secret, $account from, $account to, and $amount. So given what we've got to play with, let's say we want to preserve the account from and the account to make our account work. So the only variable that we've got to play with is the amount here, $amount. So that means we've got to put in 100 and the padding and the length and 0 for our hash to be evaluated to be the same. And you can imagine that the app logic will look at this value, and bearing in mind this is going to be sort of unprintable bytes and just weird stuff, it's going to look at that and say, well, that's not a valid amount, and that's it. That's the end of the attack. Even though you might have correctly calculated the hash for this, it's very sort of application specific, because if these bytes don't make sense in the context of the app, it will just throw it out. So that's what these 2 points are about. So the first padding, when the original hash that we were playing with, which was AA, BB, CC, whatever, and was based on the concatenation of this and the amount 100, well, the padding and length that were added to that were part of the MD5 algorithm, and you could sort of call it metadata. But because we're trying to do this hash length extension attack, we've actually got to feed in the padding and the length as part of the data. Otherwise, it won't calculate the same hash. And that crafted input isn't tolerated in this case because it will go, well, why have you got an amount that's got hex 80 and a whole string of hex zeros and all that sort of weird stuff. So it's very app specific. But that's not to say that it can never work. If you've got a parameter which will accept some kind of arbitrary input and isn't too fussy about it, then potentially you're away. So let's have a look at a different example here. So we have a seller ID, a reference, an amount, and the hash. So like before, we've got the MD5 of the concatenation of these prefixed with a secret. So MD5 $secret plus the seller ID plus the reference plus the amount. So in this case, we've got this. But we know, because we know how MD5 is working, that what's actually going on is this, that the MD5 algorithm has taken that, it's padded it, it's slapped a length on the end of this, and that's actually what it's digesting. So what about this? What if we were able to feed this as input? So here we've got the same seller ID, but our references are looking a little bit different. So what we've done is we've got 14520 in as our amount. We've got the padding and the length, and we've got a new amount. So if you apply the same formula here to this sort of URI, then you have MD5 $secret plus 1234 widget 14520 plus padding plus length plus 0.99. And if you look at this compared to this, you can see that we have just extended that input nicely, and that means we can calculate a genuine new hash that will match that. So, and now we're playing around with a parameter which is, there might not be such good validation for. It's a reference. So, I mean, they could be checking to see whether there's some strange looking bytes in there, non-printable ASCII, but if it's pretty sloppy, then it will just accept it and we're away. So there's a tool to, and I think there are a few tools that do this, but one here, Hash Extender, that will help us out here. So what we do to go from here to here is we tell Hash Extender the data that we started off with. Now, bearing in mind we don't know how long the secret is, so we give it a secret minimum and a secret maximum, which for the purposes of this demo is made fairly loose at 8 and 12. We tell it that we want to append this data, 0.99, and this is the hash that we started off with. So what the hash extender tool will do is say, okay, right, so that was the hash internal state at the point with this data, prefixed with some kind of secret. So it will assume that the secret is 8 characters, and it will work out what the padding and length would be, and then it will add on the 0.99, and then it will assume that is a new block of input. So then it will add the padding and the length for that and calculate a new hash. And then it will do the same for 9, 10, 11, 12, etc. And and figure out some alternatives which you can then easily try and see if you're lucky. Right, let's have a look at that in practice. So here is this app. So here's our seller ID, reference, amount. This is straight off the slides, and the hash, and the payment page is saying that's what you sent me, that's what I've seen. And then using my secure hash scheme, I've calculated the hash to be that. Because those two match what it's calculated and what was sent, it says, well, you couldn't have tampered with it then, all good. So here's the payment accepted. So let's have a little look. So just to show you. So if we put in super secret, which happens to be our secret, and concatenate the values that are coming in from the query string, or actually it's a post at the moment, but whatever the parameters, 1234 widget 14520, and bung it into MD5, then we get an MD5 hash starting with 75B, and that's what that is. So you can see why that works. So let's tell Hash Extender to do some work. So it's gone through some different, you can see how quick it is because it's super quick to calculate this. It's gone from different secret lengths, so 8 has scrolled up, 9, 10, 11, 12. Worked out what the new signature would be and the new, basically the new input that you need to feed it in order to get that signature. So it's saying that if you feed in this input, it'll get that signature. Now I'm going to cheat because I happen to know that the secret is 11 characters in length. What I've done there is just, let me just scroll it up a little bit, up to 11. So I've taken that string and told it to, treat that as ASCII hex and spit it out. So it's saying that this value, when you MD5 sum it, comes to 398E6. And what is that value? Well, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's our data that we've already seen. Obviously, there will be the secret preceding that, but it doesn't know what the secret is. Then our padding. Now, this is MD5, and the padding starts with hex 80, and then you get some null bytes following it, and then you get the length of the message in little endian format. So we've got D8 there, which will be the length of that in bits, I think it is. And then you've got, at the end of that, our final bit of input, 0.99. So it's saying that when you hash that, obviously with the secret before it, you'll come up with that. So,
quick question on this.
Yeah.
How come we have extra padding after the length of the message?
How come we have
After the length of the
After
original
this?
message? No, the original message, the D8. We have some extra null bytes.
we have all this?
After the length, we have extra null
This?
bytes.
No, this,
Yes.
because it's in little endian format.
Okay.
So that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Okay, so it's
So that it's
that's the whole length.
it's an 8 byte, but because it's little endian, you kind of have to read it the wrong way around. Right, can't remember what this does. We'll just put it blindly in and see what happens. Oh yeah, there you go. So we're feeding in the data. Let me just. We're feeding in the data that it's told us to feed in, 31, 32, but I've actually prefixed it with super secret, which in ASCII hex is that. No, but I'm showing you that this is why it works.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, I'll show you, obviously, when I come to use the app, you'll see it sort of working for real. So this is just to show you that that it's, that is the genuine hash, and it sort of worked it out correctly. So remember that the hash extender didn't know the super secret, but it said, if you feed in this, given that there is some data in front of it, it will be this, and it's right, because it didn't know that it was super secret. But when I put in that input, prefix it with super secret, it does in fact give us 398, which you might remember is the hash that it predicted.
11 characters in front of it.
Well, no. I mean, if I put in the MD5 sum will be different.
Yeah, but how does the hash extender know?
It doesn't need to know.
Right. The whole point is to ignore.
Because you don't need to know anything about what happened before, because it's already sort of incorporated into the hash that's been produced that you know about. Do you see what I mean? So it's the MD5 has digested, the data, which includes the super secret over here, and given you a hash. And what you're trying to do is add something onto the end of the input that is fed into the MD5 algorithm. You don't need to know what that input was, because you know that once it's digested up to that point, the hash is 7B, whatever it was. So you say to MD5, start off with 7B, whatever it is, and carry on.
Right.
That makes sense? So that's why you don't need to know what the super secret is.
Can you scroll down a bit on the results of the hash extender?
Sorry?
Can you scroll up a bit on the results of what we got back from facility?
Jerome, but there must be still a step to go back to the internal state because you're
So,
not
yeah,
getting
that's-
the full
that's
internal
exactly
state
so.
when you
Hang on, I'll do one at a time.
So yeah, what I was saying is that
Yeah.
as we can see, the new signature now on the 11 length is actually correct because we fit that.
Yeah.
So this is this is what I was trying to explain, and to understanding this, I think what others have missed, the fact that without actually having the secret, the new signature is going to be exactly the same as if we had the secret. So the actual hashed string that we provide will provide the exact same signature.
So if you
So the signature for 11 characters
Mhm.
of what has Extender expects it to be is
Mhm.
starting with 39.8 E6.
Yeah.
If you go down where we have the super secret, is exactly the same signature.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just wasn't catching that before. That's why I wanted to see if it's the same signature.
So in the actual attack, let's say we didn't know the length, but we knew, let's say it's 12 characters. It will be generating from 1 to 12, right? 12.
Yeah, you just put in whatever.
So you will be
whatever you
representing every single one of
Yeah,
them.
exactly. You'd exactly right. Yeah, yeah.
So,
You'd have to.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, you'd have to be feeding this input in. But you notice, of course, that the hash in each case is the same because you're taking the knowns, you're taking the previous hash, which was like 7b, whatever it was, and working forwards. So it's always the same. You'll always get to the same result because you know where the MD5 algorithm stopped because it was 7b, and you're feeding in the same data, which is 0.99, whatever. So that's why that's always the same. But what you're feeding in to get that will differ depending on the length of the secret, because the padding and the length will all vary in that previous block. So Jordan, what were you going to say?
You have to work back to the internal state because what you get out from the hash is final state. It's not exactly the internal state. I haven't looked how they derive it. Maybe it's a way just to derive it.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't like getting
It's
too
not
involved.
Yeah, it might be
but
a bijection or something, isomorphism, but it's not. I don't know. Actually, I haven't looked at this, but I know just from coding that there is a difference.
Yeah, but from the point of view of this attack, it's good enough to know that you're digesting this much. That gets padded. You stick a length on the end. You consume that, and you get a value out the end. And then if you add another block to that input, you can start from there, and that's good enough for what we need to do.
But the point is that you can work your way back to the internal state. Probably this might be the weakness, because otherwise you would have a collision.
Right.
Normally they are really they're really careful about collisions there. That you
In
don't
a
have
sense,
an
it's
easy
a-
collision.
In a sense, it's a collision, but isn't it?
It is.
Yeah,
Because
in
you
a
have
sense,
same-
it
you have
is
the
a
same-
collision.
You have the same hash for different strings. I mean, you have collisions always because you have only 20 bytes or whatever you have, and more.
It's not a collision. This input, if you feed this in, this will not produce the same hash. It's saying that if I've guessed the secret length to be 10, this input will produce this hash. If I've guessed the secret length to be 11, this input will produce this hash. They're not collisions.
Oh, right.
They're different. It's just, this is all guesswork.
Sorry.
Go
I'm
on.
assuming that you have to know though how it concatenates
Yep.
in it. So is that how difficult can that be?
I'll cover that.
Sorry?
Yeah, I'll cover that.
Well, because you're guessing the sequence.
Let's.
You're guessing it's concatenated, not got an ampersand or anything like that. It's just,
Yeah. I'll cover that.
Bored with each other.
So we got to this point. So for speed, because otherwise it just gets a bit tedious putting in all these different values for all these different lengths. We know that it's 11 characters, so we're just going to, for speed, go with the right one. So we got to the point that the hash extender had spat out the input that you would need to feed into it to produce the particular hash, and then I proved that it was right without it knowing the super secret by preceding the input with the word super secret in ASCII hex, feeding it, and it does indeed produce that hash. So let's see if the web application is fooled, which we can do by switching to this and changing this string. So you can see that this is pretty ugly looking input. And if it was doing any kind of checking on whether this looks sensible, it would just go, nope, which is what it would do for an amount. But maybe for something like a string or just something, it would just go, oh, okay, whatever. You know, you do what you want, whatever. I don't really care what this reference is. So when we send that, it has accepted it. It's taken the seller ID, it's taken the reference, which is looking pretty weird, but it's just accepted it anyway. And it's taken the amount, which I think maybe has scrolled off. There we go. 0.99. And it's taken our revised hash, which the hash extender gave us, and it's calculated the same hash. And so it said, yep, okay, I'll just accept 0.99 payment instead of whatever. So in that case, it worked because the reference was tolerating something that could have been defended against, but it was deciding to be nice, which is of course what always happens in demo land. Right, so final thoughts. So not always exploitable because you might get some input validation in the way, but when it is, the impact can often be high because they're sending some data to you, they do not want you to tamper with that, and they're checking it. So if you get in a situation where you can tamper with it, that's usually something pretty serious. But as we've already talked about, was referenced, it can be tricky to find because you've got to know that algorithm. If you're doing a source code review, you could spot that a mile off and go, oh, that's vulnerable, and be able to prove it quickly using something like that. If it's pure black box test. If, on the other hand, you're doing a black box test and you see something you're a bit suspicious about, you might go back to the client and say, how does that token get generated? Because at the end of the day, you're on the same side, and that's sometimes sort of forgotten about in pen testing, that it's not a them and us situation. You're there to help them secure their code. Given more time, someone with no knowledge of the system might be able to find out exactly what that algorithm is by simply taking different combinations of the parameters and playing around with it. But for speed, there's nothing wrong with saying to the client, how's that generated? And if they don't want to tell you, well, that's their problem. But if they do want to tell you, then you might be able to find out a vulnerability like this and ultimately get it fixed for them, and they'll be better off. So it's in their interest. So what if the hash scheme was using some kind of delimiter, like getting a parameter, putting a colon in, getting another parameter, putting a colon in? Well, you'd still need to know the delimiter, but it's still the same thing, really. It's just another sort of secret that you don't know. Okay, you don't know what the super secret is. You don't know what this delimiter is, but it's probably going to be a colon, or just it's going to be a small variety. It just makes it more, makes it harder to find, but it doesn't stop it. You could still use hash extenders to do that.
Does hash extender allow you to supply a custom?
Well, you could feed that in manually through.
I just wondered if it had the option.
I don't know, don't think so, but it would be trivial just to
Yeah.
just feed it in as part of the data that you put in, that you feed into it.
Actually, that's a nice trick.
But this use of a delimiter would stop actually what would be a much simpler attack, because if you think about our original problem, we've got concatenation of parameter values, and you compare it to this. So what have we done here? Well, we've just taken the number 1 and put it in to the reference to leave a smaller amount, £45.20. But if you remember the original scheme, what it was doing is doing the hash of the secret and concatenating all the parameter values. Well, if you concatenate that with that with that, it's exactly the same as that and that and that. So that's even simpler, actually.
I could see that one being more realistic to actually find.
Yeah.
that could be,
That's quite nasty. But if it had a delimiter, if it was putting a delimiter in, then that attack wouldn't work. But the delimiter does not stop a hash length extension attack, which is what this presentation is really about. So what if the secret was going on to the end? Well, then you still get sort of collisions. And the point is really that this has already been solved with like robust message authentication code algorithms, where you have a secret that's fed in, and then there are plenty, classic sort of HMAX There is a burp app that is available in the BAP store, length extension attacks it's called, which is alleges to do this kind of thing. I've not tested it, but it's there. So there are other tools available. That's it. Anyone? We've had some questions along the way, which I think was a useful thing to do because you're in the moment. But
Just on your first slide, you said, is it SHA-384 doesn't work?
Yeah.
Why just that?
well, I don't know. I don't know the mechanisms. What's going on there?
When I did some quick research, there's a shared function between the MD5 and SHAs. I forgot the name.
That's not true.
There's a name. I forgot.
But what's funny is that it skipped to generate because this is vulnerable.
It's basically the same.
So-
256 and I don't know 384 or 512. They belong together. This is the same algorithm, but with several block size or even the same block size.
Yeah.
But MD5 has nothing to do with S8.
It's
Yeah.
not the algorithm. It's
Yeah, they're different. I mean, they have similar, maybe similar architecture, but they're quite.
What I want to say is, like, you mentioned, like, obviously, high chances it goes completely purely mathematical question. So, you said that we know, like, that we know what is the state of MD5, and that's why we can, from that point, start concatenating more data. How does that work out, like, on how the algorithm works? Like, how would we, obviously, without knowing how the extender works, I can understand this, that knowing the state of MD5.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've used the word state kind of loosely. I mean, what I mean to say is that if you imagine that it's working on a series of blocks, and it's a whole number of blocks, and it's a block-based algorithm. So you feed it some input, it pads it, and it sticks a length on. It's happy with that, so it does its work, moving along, and you get, and let's just call it a hash. You get a hash out at the end of it. But what happens at it's just a continuous sort of stream, like a stream cipher. It's just it's just feeding stuff in. So if that block that we happen to give was one block longer, it would be chewing this up. It would get to that number, and it would just sort of carry on. And so what we can do is just say, well, just assume that you're at this point. So instead of starting from the default, like, initial starting conditions, just start from this condition instead, which is the hash that we know, and now move along. And I mean, in terms of this attack, that's all we need to know.
What I kind of understanding is, how do you actually define to the algorithm to start from that point?
Right. Okay. Well, that's what the hash. So you have to get into the internals of the MD5.
That's why I said that it's more of a mathematical question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all open source, and so that hash extender, the tool, I'm pretty sure it must be out. I'm sure it's open source. Yeah. And so you could look into it. So it's just taking like an implementation of MD5 and tweaking it a bit so that it starts from a known point. Yeah.
The other question was, we are feeding it but I think it's already answered the question from your previous point, that since we are feeding it the original input plus the padding plus the length, why MD5 is not appending again the length at the end before appending our own value?
It is doing that. So when we tack on 0.99 at the end, it is putting some more padding and some length on it. But it's treating the original padding and length as the original message.
Okay.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
Because we are feeding it that padding and length now as part of the message that we want it to digest. So it's not seeing that as, it's just seeing that as part of it.
So we treat pretty much, we treat the message plus the padding plus the length plus the extra
bit
as the original message.
That's the original message. And then MD5 will then add,
That's the name. The Merkle-Damgard hash function, which is shared between MD5, SHA-1 and SHA-2.
Yeah, but
Mhm.
it's the logic, but it's different implementation.
Yeah, I know.
Completely
but
different.
they all share
Have you
that
seen
same.
anything in the wild? Have you caught one of those in
Yeah,
the wild?
This was based on a real test that, and I'm not too sure what Sarusha's involvement was in it, and there were some. I can't really remember what. I know it wasn't like fully exploitable, but parts of it were. I think maybe the possibility of doing that parameter manipulation at the end. I can't say, but anyway, it was enough to for him to go, oh, that's cool, and maybe I should write a CTF, exercise based on it, which he did for the NCC con that we had, internal conference in Dublin, and I was chatting to him, and he was saying, oh, this is what I've done. And I thought, oh, that's cool. I ought to look that up because I wasn't. It's you hear so many sort of terms in InfoSec. I didn't actually know whether I knew it or not. So I went, okay, I'll just have to go and Google it. And I went, oh, actually, I didn't know that. And then, well, like a bit of crypto and the sort of mad stuff, or just something that's a bit different. And I thought that's kind of cool.
Have some more padding diagrams.
Slide on
So yeah, I mean, it is, as I said, this is not trivial to find if you know nothing about what's going on. But if you're doing a source code review, it's there right in front of you. No excuses now to miss that.
You could just review popular frameworks like
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that, and you can go and find exactly what people are going to be using.
Yeah. Yeah.
Another attack in the back for bounties.
Yeah, and this is not new. This is just an explanation of it, my explanation of it. Obviously, hash extender, it's all out there, and he would have based his work on someone else's. So that's a caveat. This is not new, but this is just my presentation of it. I thought it was interesting.
Cool.
Thank you very much.